We have two distinguished people here. When I get off the stage, it'll be filled with distinguished people. Dr. Jay Barth is somebody everybody knows. He's been around Arkansas not as long as I have, but quite a while. He was at Hendrix, and now he's the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum down the street. And he has agreed tonight, as he did in September of 2023 when Jeff was here, to lead the conversation with Jeff Toobin. Jeff was here down the street at the Clinton Center. This is a joint program tonight with the Clinton Presidential Center. He was here in September 23 talking about his book on the Oklahoma City bombing. And that had an interesting Arkansas angle because the building that was destroyed in Oklahoma was this choice that they came to after they looked at the federal building in Little Rock, and they stole some weapons in Arkansas. So there were a lot of Arkansas connections. And he'd interviewed Bill Clinton, who said a lot of things that were going on in the turmoil that led to the Oklahoma City bombing had been happening in Arkansas in certain parts. So he was here in 23 to talk about that book. And lo and behold, he's written another book. And this book, he just told me backstage, is on a subject that no one has ever written a book about, the pardon, the presidential pardon. Jeff Toobin is a CNN correspondent on legal matters. He's written numerous books. I've read the book about the kidnapping of Patty Hearst. There's a book about the O.J. Simpson trial. So he writes about legal topics, and this topic tonight covers a lot of territory. So let's welcome to Arkansas for another trip. He says he came here a lot when he was working on investigations during the Clinton administration for the journalist that he was, but he's back here to talk about his book. So welcome Jeff and Jay to the stage.
Welcome back to Arkansas, Jeff.
It's great to be back.
Awesome.
This wasn't so fancy in this part of town when I started coming here in the 90s. It's so great looking. It's terrific.
Well, thanks for another truly insightful book about a complex subject, and you have the mastery of explaining complexity about legal matters in particular so well. Before we dive deep into the presidential pardon at the heart of this book, let's get everybody on the same stage about the pardon power generally. And if you don't mind just talking a little bit about the history of the pardon power, how it got into the American Constitution, and then just a little bit of, it has four expressions. It's not just a single power, it's actually a little more complex than that. So just take it away with some how we got here with this power.
Well, Jay, I am going to demonstrate that I've covered politics as well as law by not answering your question at all.
Good job.
And say something about the National Archives and the presidential libraries. I have had the privilege of visiting just about all of them. Never been to the Eisenhower one in Abilene, Kansas, but I've been to almost all the others. And they are a tremendous resource for scholars. This book was researched in significant part in the Ford Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I've had the opportunity to work with archivists there. And this is an apolitical, hardworking people who are committed to the preservation of American history in its purest form, and it's under the gun in the current environment. And I just like to say, in a really in an apolitical way, whether it's the Nixon Library or the Clinton Library, these are tremendous national resources, and you and your colleagues do a great job. I'm grateful to you, grateful to them. And now you're going to have to remind me of what the original question was. No, I know. It was about like, what is the pardon power? Well, the pardon power is an anomaly in the American Constitution because the basic idea behind the Constitution, the Madisonian idea, is checks and balances, is that the three branches of government intersect and check one another. But the pardon power is different. It is a unilateral discretionary power of the president alone. The legislature can't stop a pardon, it can't demand a pardon, the courts can't stop a pardon or demand one. It is solely in the discretion of the president. And one thing I learned from studying the range of pardons is, for that reason, because it is so distinctive, pardons operate like an X-ray into the souls of presidents. You can learn a tremendous amount about presidents by whom they decide to pardon and whom they don't decide to pardon, because it's all up to them. The father of the presidential pardon was Alexander Hamilton, who believed in a strong executive and very explicitly took the pardon power from the pardon power of the King of Great Britain. It is the part of the Constitution that comes most directly from the British Constitution. And Hamilton thought there were two reasons to have the pardon power. One, to exercise mercy. He thought even then there were times when the federal government came down too hard on someone, and the president could ameliorate that through a pardon. But the other one is more interesting, I think, is a political tool. He said there would be times when there was some sort of rebellion in the country, and the president could use a pardon to diffuse that. And that turned out to be quite prescient, even at the very beginning of the Republic.
Yeah, and could you talk a little bit about kind of the different expressions of the pardon power? It's not just a pardon, we've got these other forms of it.
The general area is known as clemency, the powers of clemency, the president's power under Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution. And there are two main tools of clemency. One is the pardon, and the pardon is a tool that wipes out a conviction entirely. If someone gets a pardon, it's as if they were never charged with a crime at all, and that turns out to be significant for things like voting, restoring voting rights, or restoring the right to purchase a firearm. That's why a lot of people want pardons, even if they've been out of prison for a while. The other power is commutation. A commutation gets someone out of prison, but but the conviction still stands on the person's record, and there is an interesting dilemma that presidents feel when they decide whether to, even if they want to exercise clemency, do they do a pardon or do they do a commutation?
And Patty Hearst, another subject of your book, she may be the only person who's gotten both.
Well, there are other people who've gotten both, but Patty Hearst is the only person in American history who got a commutation from one president and a pardon from another. Jimmy Carter pardoned Patty Hearst, so she got out of prison early, and then Bill Clinton, the local, gave her a pardon at the request of Jimmy Carter at the very end of his term.
Yeah, interesting. So let's go to the pardon at the center of this book, and that is, of course, the pardon of former President Richard Nixon by President Gerald Ford in September of 1974. I may have been one of the few 8-year-olds in America who was both into Watergate and into the other event of that day, which was Evel Knievel's attempt to get over the Snake River in a very weird device that didn't work.
I was a little older than you were, but to show you how twisted I am, the one thing I remembered about the pardon when I started working on this book was, oh yeah, it was the same day as Evel Knievel's attempt to vault over the Snake River in Idaho. And one of the fun things, I don't want to give it away, but my book opens with a description of Evel Knievel, and I have to say, researching Evel Knievel was better than the kind of research I usually do. But What was the question again? I got
I
so
didn't get one. I didn't
involved
get to one.
in Evel Knievel.
I was just reliving
Reliving the
1974.
but just one of the reasons why the pardon was such a political earthquake is that pardons had fallen not entirely into disuse, but in relative decline. In the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, there were a lot of pardons by all the presidents because it was the only way people could get out of prison before the end of their term. Rutherford B. Hayes pardoned 1,000 people, including 44 people on death row. But once parole came into the federal system in the 1920s, where that existed as a safety valve to get people out of prison, the number of pardons went down significantly. It never disappeared entirely, but the shock of the pardon by Gerald Ford of Richard Nixon on September 8th, 1974, was even greater because, especially compared to today, pardons had fallen into disuse.
Yeah. So all during the Watergate scandal, though, in the Nixon White House, there was a lot of conversation about pardons, including the possibility of a self-pardon by Richard Nixon. Could you talk a little bit about kind of that chatter over those 2 years, especially in the last weeks of the Nixon White House?
This is the first book I've written where nearly all the participants are dead. And so that felt more like a history book than a journalism book. But one person I'm very pleased to say is still alive is my friend and former CNN colleague John Dean. And one of the great things about studying the Nixon presidency is that there are tapes and that they're now all public, and most of them are online. You can listen to them, and they are fantastic, amazing resources. And it was a particularly great opportunity for me as a journalist when I would be listening to a tape, and I go, I don't know what that means. Let me call John Dean and ask him what he meant. And John remembered a lot of these conversations. It was great. But what was interesting about the early stage of the pardon discussion was that, just to refresh your memory, it's been 50 years. I recognize there are some people here who may remember or been alive in 1972, but the Watergate break-in took place on June 17th, 1972. One thing that's known for certain is that Richard Nixon did not order the Watergate break-in. I don't think anyone believes he did. So in the immediate aftermath, there was all this discussion in the White House of what to do about it and ultimately to cover up the connections between the people who did do it and the committee to re-elect the president in 1972. And the two sort of leaders of the Watergate break-in, the people who were sort of in charge, not the burglars themselves, were two White House officials named Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy. And Liddy and Hunt, from the very beginning, wanted pardons. They wanted to get out of their criminal responsibility, and there are interesting discussions on the White House tapes about whether Nixon could pardon them. And the consistent belief of John Dean was involved in a lot of these, and Nixon and H.R. Haldeman, the chief of staff, was that it would be too politically toxic for Nixon to pardon these Watergate figures, because there was this perception that it would be, special treatment for his and part of a cover-up. That discussion gets repeated in the Trump presidency with a different outcome. But I found those discussions particularly interesting. The issue of self-pardon also came up, and people ask me about that all the time. Would a self-pardon be legal? And the clear answer to that, the only thing you can say for certain, is that we don't know for sure, because there's never been a self-pardon, so it's never been tested by the courts. But it's my view that a self-pardon would be constitutional, and I'll tell you why. The dominant mode of constitutional interpretation now is something called textualism, which means that the justices on the court narrowly interpret the words of the text of the Constitution, and they say they don't expand it past that. Famous example being abortion. The majority of the court says abortion isn't mentioned in the Constitution, so it's not protected. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution talks about the pardon power. It says a limitation on the pardon power is that you can't pardon someone from an impeachment. So a president can't pardon himself out of being impeached, that's clear. But it doesn't say that he can't pardon himself. So the text doesn't prohibit it. That means I think the text would allow it. But we don't know yet.
Interesting. So obviously the U.S. versus Nixon decision by the Supreme Court made it inevitable that Nixon was not going to survive politically. Then the question became, how was he going to leave office? And first, let's talk about that decision and how it became in some ways misunderstood. And then I'd also love for you to compare that decision and its meaning with the decision in Trump versus United States and what it has to say about executive power.
Right. Just to refresh your memory, Archibald Cox was the Watergate special prosecutor. He became aware that the tapes existed, and he issued a subpoena for them. Nixon didn't think Cox should do that. He ordered the firing of Cox, which was eventually consummated by the third-ranking Justice Department official, Robert Bork, in October of 1973. That was known as the Saturday Night Massacre, and Leon Jaworski was appointed to be Cox's successor as Watergate special prosecutor. He continued the pursuit for the tapes. In July of 1974, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to turn over the tapes. It's worth noting, parenthetically, that even Richard Nixon did not think of defying the courts, did not think of defying the Supreme Court. And you know, that has a certain contemporary resonance as well. But when the Supreme Court ruled, they said, there is this thing called executive privilege, but it doesn't cover these tapes. But the existence of executive privilege actually turned out to be a tool that subsequent presidents used a lot. Nixon resigns, and you know, sometimes in history, I think, what's most interesting is the ideas that don't even occur to people at the time. So Richard Nixon resigns on August 9th, 1974, and immediately the question becomes, is Nixon going to get indicted for his role in the Watergate cover-up? And this was especially important question because at that moment, all of his top aides, H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, John Mitchell, others, were about to go on trial in Washington for the Watergate cover-up. So the question is, was he going to be added to the indictment? Because the cover-up was for his benefit, and he was the leader of it. And so everyone was, the issue was, is Leon Jaworski going to indict Nixon in the Watergate cover-up? The best lawyers in the country were thinking about that question. Nixon had great lawyers, the Watergate lawyers were terrific, the White House had lawyers, the Justice Department had lawyers, and not one person thought that the president couldn't be prosecuted for crimes he committed in office. It was just assumed that that Nixon was at great risk for being indicted. That was the whole reason there was a pardon, to forestall an indictment of Nixon for crimes he committed in office. Fast forward to 2024. The Supreme Court decides in Trump v. United States that essentially a president is immune, can never be indicted for any official acts he takes in office, meaning that the entire Watergate investigation was essentially off limits And there was no chance for him to be indicted or even investigated under Chief Justice Roberts' opinion. And I think that really demonstrates how different the Supreme Court is 1974 and 2024, and how differently the future of presidential scandals will be addressed or not addressed by the courts, because we now have this very broad immunity for presidents even after they leave office.
So when Nixon resigns, there is a lot of question about whether his vice president will pardon him. And indeed, it is part of some of the conversations around Ford's ascension. And the chief negotiator is Al Haig in this whole affair. And Al Haig, of course, becomes very prominent in the Reagan administration, especially on the day of the assassination, because of his power hungriness.
I'm in control here at the White House. Yes.
Right, exactly. So if you could just talk a little bit about the role of a possible pardon in those final moments, really, of the Nixon presidency.
Well, let me just go back to my theory that pardons operate as X-rays into the souls of president, and talk for a minute about Gerald Ford.
Great.
Gerald Ford, Spiro Agnew resigns in disgrace in October of '73, right around the time of the Saturday Night Massacre, and Richard Nixon becomes the first president in American history to use the provisions of the 22nd Amendment. Before the 22nd Amendment, which I think was ratified in 1965, if there was a vacancy in the office of vice president, there was no way to fill it. That's why when FDR died and Harry Truman became president, there was no vice president until Truman won. When JFK was assassinated and LBJ became president, there was no vice president until LBJ won his own election in 1964. Pursuant to the 22nd Amendment, Nixon had the opportunity to nominate someone for vice president, but it had to be confirmed by a majority vote in the House and Senate. And Nixon had a problem, which was the House and Senate were controlled by Democrats. And they didn't want to elevate someone who was likely to run for president in 1976. And that's why John Connally, whom Nixon really wanted to be his vice president, was a non-starter, because he was obviously going to run for president. And so Nixon settled on Gerald Ford, who was a well-liked figure, but not an especially threatening figure as the House Minority Leader as a representative from Michigan. And if there's one thing I bet you know about Gerald Ford, is that he was a star football player at the University of Michigan. And he took seriously the idea of being a team player. And part of what he meant by being a team player was, during the brief 8 months he was vice president, he did not want to be perceived as scheming to get Nixon out of office and get himself made president. So he kept his distance to an extraordinary degree from Watergate and the powers of the presidency. He didn't know much about pardons. And it was only on August 1st, by the time that Nixon was doomed, was clearly going to be forced out of office, that Alexander Haig, who occupies a sort of fascinating double agent role in all of this, because he's Nixon's chief of staff, he becomes Ford's chief of staff, but he's really working for Nixon all along. And Haig goes to Ford on August 1st and says, in effect, a pardon would really be a good idea. And Ford sort of puts him off, but that plants the idea. He hadn't really thought about it much at that point. And over the next month, Haig becomes the person who is really the key intermediary between Nixon and Ford. And the extraordinary thing that happens is that even though Nixon is in disgrace out at the Western White House in San Clemente, California, and Ford is the president of the United States, it's Nixon who manages to manipulate Ford into giving him a pardon.
And Ford is frustrated by, all this conversation, ongoing conversation about Nixon while he's trying to become president, right, and lead on matters both international and domestic.
Right, and one issue that comes up right away, well, August 24th, so about 2 weeks after he takes office, he holds his first press conference, and he gets a bunch of questions about Nixon, and including questions about the tapes and the Nixon papers. Who owns them? Nixon, through Haig, has been demanding, hey, my White House, my papers, my tapes, ship them out to me in California. Ford doesn't know what the law is. So he asks his Attorney General, what's the law? Who owns these papers? The Attorney General assigns a young lawyer on his staff to write a memo about it, and that lawyer's name is Antonin Scalia. And then Mr. Scalia writes a very clever, interesting memo where he says it's a tradition that the President of the United States keeps all his papers, and it's the custom that the President gets to keep all his papers. But there's no law that says he gets to keep all his papers, and in fact, Jerry Ford, in a rather courageous act, says, I'm not turning these papers over to Nixon. I'm not letting him hold a bonfire of the tapes. They're evidence in a criminal case, so I can't turn them over. But that left the problem of what to do with the tapes and what to do with Nixon, because Ford didn't want to be pursued by questions about Nixon throughout his presidency. And that's what led to the pardon.
Yes, and there's this old Supreme Court case, this case of Burdick versus United States, which gets a lot of airplay in the book, that becomes kind of almost a justification to Ford for,
right.
for taking this step.
I assure you, I consider myself fairly knowledgeable about the Supreme Court. I wrote a couple books about it, and I never heard of this Burdick case at all. But what happens is, in the sort of slapdash way Ford was dealing with this, he assigns a volunteer lawyer over Labor Day weekend to research the question of pardons, like what's a pardon and who can, what does it mean? And this lawyer, a guy named Benton Becker, finds an open library over Labor Day weekend, and he finds this case from 1915, the case of George Burdick. And it's actually quite an interesting case. George Burdick was an investigative reporter for a newspaper in New York City, and he got a big scoop about corruption in the Customs Service. The U.S. Attorney wanted to follow up and investigate the corruption, so he called Burdick to testify in the grand jury. Burdick wanted no part of that and took the fifth, said, I'm not answering any questions about my reporting. The U.S. Attorney said, I've got an idea. I'm going to get you a presidential pardon so that you don't have to worry about being prosecuted. You won't have a Fifth Amendment right. And indeed, Woodrow Wilson issues a presidential pardon to George Burdick. They bring him back before the grand jury. Burdick still refuses to testify, and the U.S. Attorney locks him up for contempt of court. Burdick appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court, and Burdick wins. Why does he win? Well, the Supreme Court says a pardon is only effective if it's accepted by the recipient. And he didn't accept the pardon, so he still had his Fifth Amendment right. Moreover, acceptance of a pardon, the Supreme Court says, is an acknowledgement of guilt. And Benton Becker and Ford become obsessed with this case, and they convince themselves that they somehow have to convince Nixon to accept a pardon, when in fact Nixon wanted a pardon. And this language that acceptance of a pardon is an acknowledgement of guilt is fundamentally nonsense, and no one believed it then and no one believes it now. How many people believe that the 1,500 people pardoned for January 6th are accepting guilt? Especially since the president who granted the pardon didn't think they were guilty of anything. So, I mean, but Ford, to his dying day, carried around that page from his Supreme Court opinion in his wallet to show that Nixon really acknowledged guilt by getting the pardon. But that turned out to be another, frankly, ridiculous justification for the pardon, that this idea that, well, Nixon's really accepting guilt, acknowledging guilt, and that contributed to Ford's real snap decision to grant the pardon on Sunday morning, September 8th. You know, and the Evel Knievel ride didn't happen till the afternoon. How often, you know, does a president give an important speech at 11 in the morning on Sunday, which was one of the reasons the public was so completely shocked by this move, by the peculiar way in which it was announced.
Yeah, and you do I think, a really great analysis of the speech itself. It's a short speech, but it's a mess of a communication from the president, and partly because it was so just put together at the last minute. I mean,
right.
The whole decision was haphazard.
And it was such a contrast to what happened when Ford became president. Nixon announces his resignation on the night of August 8th, and Ford becomes president at noon on August 9th. And on that August 9th, he gives a speech in the East Room of the White House where he says the most famous thing he ever said, which was, "Our long national nightmare is over," which was a wonderfully eloquent, plain-spoken way of saying, look, you know, Nixon is behind us, Watergate is behind us, and Ford was quite popular in that first month for just that reason, that he seemed so different from Nixon. The one reason why the pardon was such a political earthquake and so bad for Ford is that he didn't explain it in any way that was comprehensible to the public, especially since he seemed to be wanting to get away from Nixon. And you know, one of the points I make in the book is that Ford was convinced, and remained convinced to his dying day, that the pardon was a healing gesture for the nation. I don't believe there was any sort of corrupt deal. A lot of Democrats over the years have thought there was some sort of deal between Nixon and Ford. You know, I'll give you the presidency if you give me a pardon. Didn't happen. Not true. Ford would never have agreed to something like that. But he was incredibly wrong about how the public would take it. And the speech, which was thrown together at the last minute, didn't justify it in any way that the public, at least at that point, felt justified.
And he had challenges really across the months leading up to his first. He decided to run for re-election, for election to a full term, and this became an albatross really across that whole period of time. But later on, I mean, he gets kind of praised for the decision. He gets a profile in Courage Award from the Kennedy Library. It really becomes kind of a key marker of his presidency, this decision. And even Teddy Kennedy, who was angry at it at the time, praises it later. What changed in how Ford talked about it, and what changed in the perception of the broader public about this?
This was one of the reasons I wrote the book, is I became aware of this tremendous change in the conventional wisdom about the pardon. The pardon was a political disaster. Whether it was the key thing that led to Ford's defeat, no one can say, but it certainly was a negative for him when he ran for president in 1976. But over the years, a lot changed. And as you said, Ted Kennedy in 2001 gave Ford this Profiles in Courage Award, and he said very explicitly, "I was wrong about the pardon, you were right." Bob Woodward, around the same time, the great journalist, said, "I was wrong about the pardon, Ford was right." When the Trump versus Nixon case was argued in the Supreme Court last year, Brett Kavanaugh asks a question, and he says, sort of in passing, Ford may have lost the election because of the pardon, but everyone now agrees it was the right thing to do. I don't know if everyone agrees that, but I think Kavanaugh was right that the conventional wisdom had shifted. So why did it shift? I think part of it has to do with the fact that we soften on the merits of presidents over time. They get more popular the farther they are from office. I mean, that's, you know, and it really applies across the board, presidents of either party. But also, I think, people recognized correctly that Ford operated in good faith, that he really did think this was a gesture to heal the country. And I think that's true. He did operate in good faith, and I think especially given, you know, what had gone on in subsequent years with presidents who weren't always operating in good faith, that contrast appealed to people. My own view, spoiler alert from the book, don't want to stop you from reading it, is the American people were right in the first place, that the pardon was a bad idea. Not because Gerald Ford did something corrupt, but because it was just a bad idea. Because you know, the criminal justice system is supposed to operate on the principle that everyone gets the same fair shake. I think we all know it doesn't always operate that way, but that's the idea. And if you have powerful people getting out of criminal liability because they have friends in high places, that is that's poison in our system. And I think, you know, if Ford wanted to pardon Nixon after he'd been sentenced to prison and didn't want him sentenced to prison, okay, maybe that would certainly have been justifiable. But giving Nixon a complete free pass so that he could, and he did, claim that he'd done nothing wrong in the first place, I think that was that sent a very bad message. That was a bad message then, and it's a bad message now.
Yeah. So we had one audience question coming in advance, and we'll get to the opportunity for folks in the room to ask questions in just a couple of minutes. But this is a kind of the question really asked us to imagine a different scenario where Richard Nixon is tried and is sentenced, and the question becomes, how would have presidential history after that played out in terms of how would a president like President Trump been
just to pick a random example,
but how would he be viewed? Have been viewed, and where would we be now on these issues if a different history had played out?
I think we would be in a better place because the message would have been sent that no one is above the law, even the President of the United States, and the idea that the White House is an accountability-free zone would not have been advanced. Now, obviously, because of the Trump versus United States decision, there's legal sanction to that idea. But the pardon, you know, certainly contributed to that idea that the Supreme Court, that you couldn't, that presidents are above the law. And I think that's a bad message to have sent then, and it's a bad message now. So I mean, now one of the complexities of this story is that Leon Jaworski, the Watergate special prosecutor, really didn't want to indict Nixon anyway. And if Ford had taken more time and done more research, and you know, he would have found that there was no reason for a pardon because Nixon probably wouldn't have been indicted anyway. But and that would have certainly been, you know, it would have been better for Jaworski, the prosecutor, to make that decision than for Ford. But Ford didn't, you know, rush the decision to issue the pardon.
Yeah. So obviously we've seen a lot of presidents after Ford make pardons and not make pardons in certain cases. And at the close of your book, of course, you talk about some of those patterns, and you make the case that a guy named Willie Horton, who we all know from electoral politics, becomes pretty central to a lot of the dynamics around pardon making in that post-Ford era.
Right. Just to refresh your memory, Willie Horton was someone serving a first-degree murder term in Massachusetts in the mid-1980s, and under a program that Governor Michael Dukakis did not initiate but approved of. Even though he was convicted of first-degree murder, he was given a furlough, and he did not return to prison, went to Maryland, committed horrible rape and murder, and he actually is still alive and in prison in Maryland. When Dukakis ran for president in 1988, the George Herbert Walker Bush campaign made great hay of the fact that Dukakis let this murderer out of prison, and he went on to commit these horrible crimes. When you combine that specific case with the general tougher line on crime that spread throughout the country in the 80s and 90s, it made presidents very reluctant to let anyone out of prison, lest they become the Willie Horton of their day. And you see that Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama is basically the only president who ever decided to release significant numbers of people from prison. Late in his presidency, he established something called the clemency program, where volunteer lawyers sort of took the cases of people who were serving mostly low-level drug dealers, and he wound up issuing commutations, not pardons, to about 1,500 of them. But and fortunately, none of them, to my knowledge, have committed terrible crimes since they got out. But presidents have not been, mostly not been willing to take the risk that they would release the next Willie Horton.
Good. So I'm going to ask a last question, then if folks do have questions, we'll get to you. Obviously, a lot of conversation in recent days about the Biden pardons at the end of his administration, and of course some questions about auto pen usage. And I would love any thoughts there, because I'm betting somebody asked that question.
When I've been on television, writing, I try not to be too categorical about things. I'm not a judge. I can't tell you, what the law will be on any given thing with certainty, except this. There is a 30-page opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel it comes from the George W. Bush administration, where it says, any document signed by directed by the president to be signed by auto pen is exactly as authoritative as anything he signs by hand. The auto pen makes no difference. So the pardons signed by auto pen are the same as anything else he signed in person. Whether that's these pardons were good pardons or bad pardons, obviously we have lots of disagreement about that, but they are pardons and they can't be overturned.
Okay, good. All right, we got time for some questions. We got a microphone. We got microphones on each side, and ask you to come down to the microphone, please, and obviously try to make your questions as concise as possible so we can get as many in as possible.
Thank you, Dr. Barth, and of course, Mr. Toobin. So now that the Supreme Court has given the president complete, he can't be charged for anything. So how does that leave the Congress with trying to impeach him if they can't bring up any evidence of a crime against him?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, well, let me just say that the impeachment power still exists. The decision in Trump v. United States doesn't change whether Congress can impeach the president, the House can impeach the president, or the Senate can convict him. The question is, how could they get evidence now? And that's where the big change is. The most extraordinary thing about Chief Justice Roberts' opinion is not only does he say that official actions can't be the subject of prosecution, they can't be the subject of investigation. So, now we have a situation where the president, has complete control of the executive branch. I don't think Attorney General Bondi is going to be appointing any special counsels to investigate President Trump, and I don't think Speaker Johnson is going to be undertaking an impeachment investigation of Donald Trump. These issues aren't ripe yet. But, someday, some president is going to be under investigation. And as a result of the Trump versus United States opinion, the president is going to say, I'm not turning over any evidence. I'm not letting my aides testify because we were talking about and engaging in official actions, and that's off limits. And I think that, and if you look at Watergate, I mean, the smoking gun of Watergate, what got Nixon fired, was a meeting on January 23rd, 6 days after Watergate, where Nixon and H.R. Haldeman agree on a plan to tell the CIA, to tell the FBI, to stop the Watergate investigation on national security grounds. And there were no national security grounds, as they acknowledge. But the president has official authority over the CIA and the FBI. That was an official action. So if Trump versus United States had been in effect in 1972, 3, 4, he would have been within his rights not to turn over the tapes, and we'd have a very different world. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here and joining the program. President Ford, in his later years, it seemed like he effectively communicated why he did the pardon, for the most part. When you go back and read about 1976, it doesn't seem like he really had his message down during the election as to why he did the pardon. Do you think he was trying to find the message, or did it just not connect with the American people? There's some debate that maybe the pardon contributed to his loss. Of course, it was a narrow election. Anything may have impacted. But it seems like Ford struggled in '76 trying to explain that. Did he explain it and people just didn't care, or a little bit of both? Thank you for your...
I think... I don't think his explanation changed a lot over the years. I think he actually told the truth about his plan and the pardon from day one. I don't think the public was ready to hear it, especially in 1974. Watergate had consumed at least the news media, if not the country, for 2 years by that point. Now, obviously, today, people aren't thinking about Watergate, and in 2001, they're not thinking about Watergate. And the idea that Ford, who was supposed to be such a breath of fresh air, and seemed to be such a breath of fresh air in August of 74, by September of 74, he is appearing to be part of the continuing cover-up. That was what so many people said at the time, that this was just a continuation of the cover-up. I don't think that was really the case, but it was not a message the public was ready to hear in September of 1974. And as passions cooled about Watergate, the public became more receptive to it. But it was not. But it was it was too late to help him in the '76 election by that point.
And very interestingly, the day of the pardon, his press secretary resigns in protest,
right,
which probably also contributes to a sense of there was something to be.
And it reminded people of the Saturday Night Massacre, where Elliot Richardson, who had been the Attorney General, and William Ruckelshaus, the Deputy Attorney General, resigned in protest rather than fire Archibald Cox. So that gave the whiff of Watergate it made it stronger. Yes?
I misunderstood. I didn't think official acts included CYA of your illegal actions.
Well, welcome to the Supreme Court of 2024.
So that's what it's saying.
Well, that, you know, like for example, and this came up. Some of you may be old enough in this room to remember the Mueller investigation. And the Mueller investigation was about, in part, was Trump and Russia, you know, colluding in some way to win the 2016 election. But the main part of the investigation was, did Trump try to interfere with the investigation and try to cover up? And one big part of the investigation, Mueller's investigation, was the firing of the FBI director. Remember James Comey, who Trump said afterwards, well, I fired him to stop the Russia investigation. He said it to Russian visitors. He said it in an interview. Is that a crime? Is that a cover-up? You know, if you fire someone to stop an investigation of you, maybe that's a crime. The Trump versus United States decision puts that completely off limits because the president, under the laws, has the right, the official right, to fire the FBI director. That means, under Chief Justice Roberts' opinion, law enforcement cannot conduct an investigation of that. And you look horrified as I'm telling you this, but take it up with Chief Justice Roberts, not with me, okay? But that's what the law is now.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
If I may, and if this question is off grounds for tonight, I'll walk back and understand.
Please hold it a little closer to your mouth there.
I've recently finished reading your book, Homegrown, and I was struck by a number of things. It was obviously well written, and your timeline is excellent. And
Obviously, yes. Yeah.
But I was struck by two things.
Hold it a little closer, yeah.
Struck by two things. Merrick Garland's allowance of so many lawyers to defend McVeigh as well as experts, and just an unlimited budget, apparently. And I'd like you to comment about that. And Merrick Garland, for the audience, was the...
He was a deputy assistant. He was deputy assistant. He was high up in the Justice Department, but not someone who needed to be congressionally confirmed. He was an earnest young lawyer on the rise.
in charge of the process.
Put in charge of the investigation, yes.
And second of all, the use of privileged information by that lawyer in northwest Oklahoma. And I would assume you had access to all of that.
Yeah.
And I'd like you to comment about the ethics that was involved with that.
Well, okay, those are two very different questions. Merrick Garland was very concerned that the trial of Timothy McVeigh not turn into the trial of O.J. Simpson, which was going on at the same time. I can recommend a book about that if you'd like that as well. But the O.J. case was considered kind of a circus, and Garland thought that the worst thing that could possibly happen was that Timothy McVeigh get convicted, and then for some reason the conviction gets overturned because of some sort of error in the trial, or some reason that he didn't get an adequate defense. So the Clinton administration said, basically gave him a carte blanche to hire experts, hire lawyers, and Stephen Jones, the lawyer, I think probably took excessive advantage of that, but he did do that. Many years later, he donated all his papers to the University of Texas, and including all his interactions with McVeigh, and I was able to draw on those to write this book, and I think a lot of lawyers were upset by the idea that Stephen Jones disclosed so many attorney-client confidences. I was glad that he did. And I wrote about it in the book, so I felt a little churlish about pointing out that, hey, maybe he shouldn't have done that. But he did, and they were in the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas, and I took advantage of them.
And I will use this as an opportunity to say we are approaching the 30th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, and on the evening of Friday, April 11th, we will have an event dedicated to better understanding that event, the way in which justice came to be, and the ongoing legacy of Oklahoma City. So I invite you to the Clinton Presidential Library that evening as well. I think we are, Nate, you have prerogative.
Yes, a couple of weeks ago, Jay and I sat in a room of distinguished legal scholars who were giving the they were collectively giving the Arnold lecture at the law school. And none of them wanted to address the large pachyderm in the room. And I want to ask you, as a legal correspondent.
Yeah, I'm sort of surprised it hasn't come up yet,
yes.
but...
So let me set it up this way. In light of what you now know about Chief Justice Roberts' jurisprudence and his calculations, is there any reason for the people in the room to have confidence that if there is a confrontation between the administration and a federal district court judge's ruling, that we won't have a serious constitutional crisis that will make Watergate look like a walk in the park?
Well, you know, one thing I have thought about a lot as you know, we're covering the beginning of the second Trump administration is the Supreme Court's decision in U.S. v. Nixon in 1974, where the issue was, did Nixon have to turn over the tapes? And the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that he did. And again, what's most interesting at any given time is what's not said. And I had access to what was going on in San Clemente and in the White House after that decision. And one thing Richard Nixon did not consider was not complying with the decision or having a bonfire of the tapes or just, you know, ignoring or defying the Supreme Court. That was not something that was under consideration. Now, the issue obviously is, you know, there are all these cases challenging the you know, early initiatives of the second Trump administration, many of them related to immigration and expulsion of people from the country, many of them also related to reduction in government services. And in many cases so far, district courts have ruled against the president. Now, the president, to be fair, including last night on Fox, you know, said he would follow court orders. But there is, the wiggle room in all of this is the administration is racing to get as many of these cases to the Supreme Court as possible. And it certainly looks like along the way, they are either going to defy or ignore or circumvent lower court rulings. And in some respects, they may already have, including this case about the removal of people to El Salvador. And I don't expect that will be the last time we see that. So I think we are looking at a lot of conflict between the lower courts and the Trump administration. The great conflict would be if the Supreme Court rules against him. I think what's most likely to happen, given what I know about the Supreme Court, is that in virtually all of these cases, they will rule in favor of Donald Trump, because this is a court very deferential to executive power. And I think perhaps in a subtle way, all this discussion of defiance of the courts operates as pressure on the court to rule, because the not so subliminal message is, hey, Supreme Court, if you rule in my favor, you don't have to worry about this whole problem of defiance of the courts. And if you look at, you know, the judicial philosophies of 6 of the justices, it seems likely that they'll rule in his favor, but I don't know that for sure, and we shall see.
All right. let us thank Jeff Toobin for the pardon.
And thanks to all our friends at C-SPAN for covering this.
Let me also tell you how fortunate we are that Jeff made this stop. Last night he was in Dallas. He was at a book signing event in Santa Fe the night before, and last weekend he went to the Tucson Book Festival. 100,000 people were there. So we really greatly appreciate that you consider Little Rock an important way station on your way back home. So thank you for stopping here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'll be happy to sign your books outside.